Welcome back. Now we have our electrocute effect. So far it's looking pretty good. We don't have the beam yet. It's also quite silent. I'd like to play a sound, and I'd like to use a gameplay cue for that. And in doing so, I'd like to take a little bit of a deeper dive into how our project handles gameplay cues in general. So here in GA Electrocute, I'm going to make a new blueprint, and we're going to choose Gameplay Cue Notify, and we're going to choose Static, just like we have for the cue that we're using for the blood particles and sound on the enemy. We're going to select that, and we're going to call this GC_shock burst. Now, shock burst is a static gameplay cue, and for static gameplay cues, we override the function on execute. And we can plug in target and parameters into the parent function as we're overriding this. But really, I'd just like to get my target, get the location of it, and this is, of course, aura. I'm going to get actor location. And I'd like to play a sound at this location. So I'm going to use play sound at location. And the sound I'd like to play, well, we can take a look at Content, Assets, Sounds, and Abilities. And there's a shock with SFX shock. There's also a shock loop, and we'll get to that later. But I'm going to use SFX shock right here. It's just going to be hard-coded right in, and I'm going to hook up on execute and hook up play sound at location to the return node, and we have a basic shock burst gameplay cue. Now, this cue needs to be associated with a gameplay cue tag. So if we look in class defaults, we can choose a gameplay cue tag. I don't have a gameplay cue for shock burst, so I'm going to go to project settings and just add one here in the editor. So going to gameplay tags, we have our gameplay cue. We have melee impact. I'm going to add a new one, gameplay cue dot shock burst. Now our gameplay cue tag has shock burst, and if we go back to shock burst, we can give it the shock burst tag. Notice we can't choose anything else that's not a gameplay cue tag. So now that this has the shock burst tag, we can activate this gameplay cue. I'd like to go back to electrocute, so let's go into GA electrocute. I'd like to make this on execute get called. So here in electrocute, as soon as we've updated the facing target, we can do this even before, just before playing the montage. We can execute a gameplay cue by using execute gameplay cue on owner. And if we do this, of course, shock burst has this my target, which will be the owner or the owning avatar. This function handles setting that for us. We do have to choose the gameplay cue. We're going to choose shock burst for this, and we can go ahead and just call this function like this. And if we go into shock burst and we just print the name of my target, so we can use get object name, and we can use a print string. We can print the name of this my target. So if we go back, now we hear that sound, we're printing the name. If we try this in multiplayer, setting it to number of players to 2, and we try this on the client, it works as well. That's the magic of gameplay cues. So now we have a gameplay cue to handle that starting sound. Great. Now, if you take a look at your output log, you may notice that there's a warning pretty far up somewhere. Looking for yellow text here. Warning, no gameplay cue notify paths were specified in default game.ini under, and it even tells you, script gameplay abilities, ability system globals. It says falling back to using all of game. It even goes on to say this may be slow on large projects. Consider specifying which paths are to be searched. You see, we're executing a gameplay queue by gameplay tag, and the gameplay queue manager has to search our entire project for the gameplay queue notify shock burst that has this gameplay queue tag. But we can make this a little bit more optimized by keeping our gameplay queue notifies in one folder or a small number of folders. So we could go into ability system and just have one folder for our gameplay queue notifies. This is an optimization that allows the gameplay queue manager to not have to search all of these folders. So what we would do is create a new folder. I'm going to put it in Blueprint's ability system and call this gameplay queue notifies. And we can move all of our gameplay queues into this. So if I have my Blueprints ability system gameplay queue notifies folder available here, then I can browse to GC shock burst, and I can drag that into my gameplay queue notifies, and I can move it there. Now we also have another gameplay queue. If we go to ability system, enemy queues, we have GC melee impact. Now, if you don't want them all in the same folder, we can specify multiple paths, and we'll see how. But if we want one path and we want it to be as optimized as possible, we can put all of our gameplay queue notifies right there in gameplay queue notifies. We can move that there. I can delete that queues. And now we know all of our gameplay queue notifies are here, and we can tell the gameplay queue manager, look, you don't have to search the whole project. Start here. So how do we tell it that? Well, that warning told us where to go. We're going to close our project. We're going to find our config folder. And where did that warning tell us to look? It told us to go to defaultgame.ini and to add something here under Ability System Globals. Now, we already have it here because we set our Aura Ability System Globals as the Ability System Globals class to use. Here is also where we can specify our gameplay queue notifies path. So we can add that path with plus, and we can say gameplay queue notify paths equals, and we can provide the path. We start with game. This takes the place of the content folder. So our folder is what comes after that. We had blueprints, ability system, /gameplay queue notifies. Now, if we had, say, kept that other folder where we had our enemy's gameplay queue, we could have added that too. We could add blueprints, ability system, and whatever other path here that we want. We can have multiple paths here. That's fine. But we can also have them all in the same folder right here. Gameplay queue notifies. That works too. So that's the first thing I'd like to do a deep dive on. Now we have our queue notifies set. Now, there's another thing I want to bring to your attention. I'm going to hit debug. I'll go ahead and let those asset editors open again, and I'm going to execute a gameplay queue, but first I'm going to come back into Writer and do a project-wide search for max RPC per net update, and go into gameplayQManager.cpp and place a breakpoint right here and check for too many RPCs. You see, there's a max number of RPCs, and our gameplay queues are replicated as RPCs. And there's a limit to how many that can be sent per net update. I'd like to see what that limit is by placing a breakpoint and coming back in here and right-clicking. Now that's going to execute that gameplay queue, and if we check out this variable, we see that it's an iConsole variable. Right here, we see 2. So if we expand it and show data, we see shadowed value. There's 2 elements in it, and they're both set to 2. That's the number of RPCs that can be sent. That's the number of gameplay queues that can be sent per net update, and that's kind of low, and we can override that. Now, we don't want to override it to a huge number like 1,000, but 2 is a bit low. We can go up to about 10. The Lyra game project sets it to 10. Well, how do we set it? Well, notice that this is a console variable, and we can set console variables for our project. So what I'm going to do is hit stop, and back to our config folder. This time, I'm going to go into defaultengine.ini. And we can set console variables by using square brackets and typing console variables. And we can add one that's net, all lowercase, dot max RPC per net update. We can set that to a value. Now, like I said, Lyra uses 10, we can use 10, and 10 is plenty. You really don't need more than 10, trust me. And if you do need more than 10, you should rethink your strategy and your design, right? Because that's too many RPCs per net update. We got to be kind of sparing with them. That's kind of why we don't use gameplay cues for just everything that we could. We use them for things that we have to use them for. So now that we've set this to 10, we can save and close that, and we can run in debug mode again. And we can press play, and we can activate our ability by right-clicking, and I removed my breakpoint, so I'm going to put it back and right-click and take a look at the value here. And now we see that we have 10 instead of 2. Went from 2 to 10. Great. So now we can accommodate for more gameplay cues, but again, this is per net update. Net updates are not as often as, say, the tick function by any means, but they're not slow either, right? We could be receiving net updates 60 to 100 times per second, depending on bandwidth and what's going on in the game. So, you don't need more than 10. 10 is actually probably overkill, but at least now we don't have it set to 2, which is kind of ridiculously low. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go into GameplayCue notifies, open my shock burst, and I don't want to print a string anymore. I just want to hear that sound, and that sound is sounding great. And the sound takes a little bit longer than my montage seems to allow. So I think I am going to go into my cast electrocute montage and set the rate scale a little bit slower. Not much, 0.75 should do it. Maybe even 0.6. Yeah, that's better. And now that it's a little slower, we can blend in a little slower. We could blend in even 0.2 or 0.3. Yeah, that looks good. I might even go back down to 0.5 for the rate scale. And I'm going to zero in on 0.55. I think that is good. That's the sweet spot. Let's hear it. Yep, that sounds great. Okay, so now we have another gameplay cue in our project, and we're using it in our electrocute ability. Things are sounding good. It's time to start making things look good too. And we'll do that next. I'll see you soon.